You guys requested it. You guys asked for it. So here it is. Here is my very humble review of Daniel Greene's latest novel, his latest cyberpunk novel, A Witch's Sin. It is book 1 in the Neon Ghost trilogy. He had an amazingly successful Kickstarter. I think he almost hit 300K. A great cover art, a great graphic design, interior, exterior, a great audiobook narration, which I listened to most of this book in that format. But you know how it is, everybody. It's what's inside that counts. It's what's inside. So does the story itself, does this novel that Daniel Greene created, his 3rd novel to date, match all of the other splendor? Well, that is what we are here to find out today, everybody. But before I begin, what is the hook? What is A Witch's Sin about? And I don't think I'm going to be able to wear these glasses the entire time. In the far future, a poisonous haze forces humanity into megastructures for protection. Amid the stirring factions, a woman named Taya dreams of being an enforcer. Mentored by Quinn, a cop by day, enforcer by night, she takes her first gig, which seems simple until it spirals her deeper into a world she didn't know existed. So what did I think? Well, let us begin with not character. Let's talk about setting, because I think this is probably where Daniel Greene spends most of his time. I enjoy his settings. I really enjoy the setting from his first novel, his first 2 novels. And I enjoyed this one too. It has a very familiar feel. It's very cyberpunk with a twist, All these people, they live in these mega structures, which are mega structures, these massive buildings, multi-floor buildings. It seems to be that the lower you go, the worse off you are. The higher you go, the better. Very similar, very reminiscent to the film Dread, which was also a decent pulpy movie. And he's throwing around terminology like it's going out of style, but I say that in the best way because I think that is how you world build. You don't dump exposition on everybody. You don't tell them ad nauseum about what this world is, why it works. Granted, there is some exposition here, but it didn't really get in the way for me completely. So I will commend him on that. He has a knack for world building. I think anyway, the detail of it. Now, the originality of it, that is another thing. Like I said, it's reminiscent of Judge Dredd. It's cyberpunk, right? Is ubiquitous in this setting. It's exactly what you'd expect. There's implants, there's augmented realities, there's jacking in, there's all kinds of this stuff. If you've ever played a cyberpunk video game or role-playing game or read a cyberpunk novel, it's all very familiar here. He adds something else. He adds a little bit of a twist, and that twist is magic. So there's vampires. There's vampires in this world, which is kind of strange. And I was hoping that he would, I don't know, use the setting to his advantage, right? Give us a new twist on vampires. What does a vampire mean in a cyberpunk setting? Well, unfortunately, it's more or less the exact kind of vampire you'd expect from any other classical vampire story, albeit in a cyberpunk world. So while it's not a terrible idea, I like genre mashups. I felt like it could have been blended in a little bit more. It could have been more cleverly integrated into the setting itself. So if you like cyberpunk, if you like vampires, you're probably going to like the setting that you find in A Witch's Sin. Let us move on with character, and we should start with Taya because she is our lovely protagonist. She's the woman who graces the cover of this book, falling to her death. I don't know, you'll have to read the book and find out. But she is headstrong, youthful, cocky. She wants to be an enforcer. She has to get mentored by her buddy Quinn, kind of her buddy. He's a kind of a cop by day, enforcer by night, and he's giving her these little gigs to earn her stripes, so to speak. She has trauma. She's lost a fiance. The only critique I have in that regard is I don't feel like it was used effectively for her character arc, her character transformation, how it integrated into the plot, how it's relevant to the plot, how it's relevant to how she responds to events. And so unfortunately, while it's there, right, it's there on paper, I don't feel like it was completely utilized to the best of its ability, which is going to make us feel. It's going to make us feel. And I think that's probably the biggest issue I have with all of the characters in this is they never really made me feel. I don't want you to think they're completely two-dimensional. They're unique in kind of an anime way, and I'll talk about anime or manga a little bit later as we get into the plot and the writing and all of this stuff, and including the setting, which I already talked about, but I'll bring it up again. And so you might say that as her flaw, right? She's headstrong. She's always kind of thrusting into these crazy events, these things that are going to get her in trouble, things that are going to catch up to her. And I would say that kind of more or less happens. I don't feel like she was quote unquote punished enough, right? And I don't want you to think that her actions should be punished, but when a character goes through an arc, a transformation, which this character definitely does, you tend to feel for them, right? You tend to feel for them at their highs, you tend to feel for them at their lows, and it just never telegraphed to me on the page, unfortunately. So let's talk about next. We'll talk about Quinn, her buddy, her mentor. Well, kind of buddy, like I said, not really her buddy. He has an interesting accent, which I'll get to about in the writing section. But he's kind of this rough and tough dude. He's showing her the ropes. He's kind of that archetype that you expect, right? Tough guy, thinks he knows everything, which he kind of does. He's an experienced guy. He's the mentor figure. The strange thing is, though, the way this novel is set up is I thought, I don't want you to think this is going to be like a party of people, right? Like a group of people, like in a Dungeons & Dragons game or something like that. But it kind of felt that way because there's another character I'm going to talk about next, or two more actually. So it seemed to be that they were going to go through this journey with Taya, right? As she tries to become an enforcer, as she delves down into this mystery, and it is a mystery, but they kind of don't. Quinn especially, he has a really heavy influence in the beginning of the book, and he kind of just vanishes until he shows up again, which seemed more like it was a convenience for the plot than actually the way characters might interact. I don't know. I don't want to get ahead of myself because I don't want to talk about the plot right now. We'll get to that soon. So he plays that archetype. We have the headstrong archetype, the hero. We have the mentor archetype. And let's talk about this other archetype we have here. Her name is Juno. I think she's a teen. She's a teen French. I know she's going to school anyway. I thought she was going to be kind of like the tech head, the one that would get her information. And, you know, she kind of plays that role to a degree. But again, she's underutilized. She pops up, again, when the plot seems to want it to. Not when the character feels like it might poke their head in. And in the beginning, just like with Quinn, these two side characters, the book is front-loaded with them. However, they kind of vanish as if Greene wasn't sure what to do with them. They do play a part in the plot. But again, it only seems to matter when the plot asks for it. So let's talk about Oscar next. Oscar is a vampire. So you have an interesting dynamic here, right? You have Taya, you have a vampire, the undead, the literal undead. So she's at odds with him. She's forced to work with him, and it's uncomfortable because of who he is. These vampires, as you know, vampires are, they're not very well liked. And he actually is with her throughout most of the novel. While their relationship does develop over time, I didn't really buy it. It didn't feel like a transition. It didn't feel like an arc. It didn't feel like a transformation. I'll say the word again. It just felt like he was there. He said some things. He helped her out, but I didn't feel it. Again, I didn't feel it. So overall, the characters, you know, they exist, they represent archetypes, but they feel like that's all they are. They don't feel like living, breathing people. They don't feel like they're driving the plot. They feel like they're servants to the plot. And I think that's the trickiest thing to do in a novel, is to make it feel like the characters are driving the story. Even if it's a plot that is external, right? They're just kind of stumbling their way through as things are thrown at them. But a lot of times we just have a lot of navel gazing. We have a lot of meandering. We have very, very long chapters that they just kind of feel structured in a strange way, which I think is why I should move on and talk about the plot. So this plot, it's a mystery. It's kind of funny because Daniel Greene and his other novels it was a mystery at its heart. Not only a mystery involving a child, a mystery that unraveled into something or developed into something far bigger than it seemed, far bigger than a dead child in the case of his old novel, far bigger than a case of a missing child, which is what we find in this novel. As I mentioned, Taya is eager to become an enforcer, and Quinn throws her this simple missing persons job, this gig. So she goes after it, seems easy, and of course it blows up into something even bigger, kind of illuminating the factions that exist in this world, in the cyberpunk world. Mysteries are extremely difficult to write though, and I'm really curious why he keeps reaching toward them, because I feel like it's a true art to tell a successful mystery story, something that is compelling, something that is clever, something that is just interesting. And I would argue that to have a weak mystery means you must have interesting characters. I wouldn't say the characters are very interesting in this. I didn't feel like they were really overcoming their struggles, really transforming as people, really digging deep into those low points and rising up from the ashes, because this is a very heroic novel. I don't think that every character has to rise from the ashes. Some can completely fail in what would be called a tragedy. And what do you need in a mystery? Well, you need great red herrings. Red herrings are the things that you think are the answer to the puzzle, even though they're not. And they have their own interesting spins. But unfortunately, these ones, they don't really have it. And I think that's, again, one of the biggest failings of this novel is that because the characters, they're fine. I think the characters are okay. And I probably could have forgiven that if this mystery would have been just incredibly deep, kept me guessing the entire time, but it just didn't. I felt like I was kind of drifting through the story. There wasn't a lot of momentum, which brings me to chapter construction. And this is the weirdest thing about this book. Well, one of the weirdest things about this book. There are very long chapters in this book, extremely long. I don't know, man, 10,000 words or so. I couldn't keep track, but I really think it could have benefited from cutting these things up, because you'll have multiple scenes and chapters. You'll have a lot of meandering in these chapters. You'll have a lot of like I don't know where this chapter is going. And if you read a lot of books or you watch a lot of movies, you'll know that there's a rhythm, there's a structure to scenes. These chapters are very unstructured. You might have an interesting hook and then it kind of just drifts and meanders and you get some information, but again, it's just information. And then maybe at the very end, there's kind of a cool little hook at the end to pull you into the next chapter. But they are very long. They're very floaty, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so it was really difficult for me to be invested while I was reading these things. So from a pacing standpoint, I think the chapter construction is really its weak point. And I know that's kind of talking about writing a little bit, but I think it's worth bringing up because it dictates the pacing of this book. And the plot really felt like this was plotted out on paper. And I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say because of course books are plotted most of the time, even if they're not plotted. When the author goes back through the text, they look for all the plot holes, they make sure it's compelling, it's interesting, it's engaging for the reader. But like I was talking about earlier with the characters usually driving the plot or feeling like they're being thrust into a plot, this felt like characters moving along a beat sheet on an outline, going from place to place as the plot dictated it, rather than the other way around. And this really gets into the realm of Matt Stone and Trey Parker's philosophy on storytelling, where you don't want to have a lot of, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. You always want to have a, but then this happens, and therefore this happens, right? It's causality, it's conflict. There is conflict in this novel. I don't want you to think that, but there is so many and thens that it became extremely difficult for me to get through this book. So I think from a developmental editing standpoint, this could be tightened up immensely because a plot is not just merely events in a sequence. They have highs, they have lows, they have mids, and there's a construction to that. Right? There's a construction to that. All right, I'm going to cut this in because I totally forgot to talk about it, and that is tone. And tone in this book, normally I don't talk about tone, but I was confused in this book because on one hand, this feels like it's supposed to be just kind of a fun romp, right? We have a cyberpunk world. We have somebody who wants to be this badass enforcer. She gets all these implants. She gets all these power-ups. She's leveling up. There's vampires running around. There's all kinds of chaos. But then there's like a lot of swearing in it. There's a lot of dark subject matter. There's a lot of punctuation of emotional trauma, which, you know, it's there on paper, but I never felt it. So I was trying to figure out constantly, is he trying to write a fun novel? Like an anime or a manga, where sure, they're dealing with heavy subject matter from time to time, but it's not held to the same quality standards as like a dramatic film, for instance, right? You're not going to take an anime word for word and film it like a movie with real people. It's going to sound cheesy as hell, I'm sorry, but I think we forgive it because of the artwork, because of the stylization, and that's okay. Hell, I love watching anime from time to time. That's not the point. It's me on a quest to figure out what he was going for. So we have this kind of fun-ish sort of book with characters, I guess, but then there's tons of swearing in it. There's tons of darker subject matter, as I mentioned. And so it almost felt like it didn't quite know what it was trying to be. And I think I kind of critiqued this on his first novel too, where it's almost this Sanderson-esque kind of, not reality, but sort of reality. But then he really digs deep with the language sometimes, the sexual subject matter sometimes. And so on one hand, it feels like it's an everybody book, but then on the other hand, it feels like an adult book, but then the storytelling and the characters and the plot don't really rise to that adult level. I don't know. I don't think you should really be questioning the tone of a novel as you read it. And that's kind of what hit me, because you'll be reading this book and you'll think like, oh, okay, I kind of know what he's going for. And then you kind of get hit with a brick by something. You're like, huh, that's interesting. That doesn't quite fit. And then you'll kind of be going down that path for a little bit, and then it'll sway you back to the other way you used to feel. And so I think tone is incredibly important in books, consistency of tone. And if you're going to break that consistency, make it purposeful. This did not feel purposeful. I'm editing this video and I absolutely forgot to bring up this point, and I think it's incredibly important because this event happens in chapter 1, the opening scene, the hook scene, you might argue. And it's when Taya is on this gig. She's going with her mentor, Quinn, chasing this guy. We don't really know why she's there. She finally finds him, and this is the text we are presented with. Walking over, well, there is the gerunds again. Taya stomped on the back of the man's knee, resulting in a full-throated scream from the pedophile. The key word being pedophile. Why do I think this is a failure? Because this is telling, right? This is when we learn who this man is. We learn he's a pedophile through exposition, through description. And that is not how you want to do it whatsoever, because you can imagine this character going into the scene. She is incredibly invested in finding this man. Why is she so invested? Is it because of the money? Is it because of something else? And I would argue that the fact that he is a pedophile really would have worked well, having us feel it through Taya because of what happens, because there was a child involved, a kidnapped child that is a core part of this mystery. So you can see right here This was absolutely squandered in chapter 1, a way in which you could have us understand. You could see the drive behind Taya, behind our protagonist. But instead, it is described to us in a very plain way and therefore has zero impact. Let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This novel is written in a much more detailed manner than the first novel, or his first two novels I read. I felt that was fine. The first two novels were more noirish, detective in a way, and so the simple, punchy prose I felt worked for that, except for the lack of subtext, of course. And unfortunately, Daniel Greene still has no subtext in his novels. And I think that's really a massive failing, because subtext is where we feel it. That's where we feel it. We don't get it from the information. We get it from what is not said, the unsaid. Two people talking to each other about something, but they're meaning something else. Metaphor, symbolism, the way someone looks at someone else, the actions they have in response to something. All of the stuff that we are not told, we must infer, would have again helped this novel immensely. But before I get too deeply into that, I'm going to put up a line here on the screen, and I want you to tell me, what accent do you think this character speaks in? I'll give you a moment. So this line is from Quinn. It is spoken by Quinn in chapter 1. I believe it's his very first line that he speaks, so it's on the very first page of this entire book. And I was confused. I read this. The problem with phonetic writing is that you stop, you slow down, you stumble until you get the hang of it, which oftentimes you never do. Now, writers of old like Mark Twain and John Steinbeck use it liberally. Stephen King used to do it all the time as well. But in the modern age, it is frowned upon because why? Just the reason I told you. You stumble through it. It's unidentifiable sometimes. In this case, it's absolutely unidentifiable. I remember I pasted this line on my Discord server. The only person who responded said, "Oh, I think that's Australian." It's not Australian. You find out in, I think, chapter 5, okay, way far into this book, that this environment they live in is an urban environment. So it's like a New York environment, meaning this is more of a New York accent. I personally heard Jar Jar Binks when I read this line, so I was absolutely confused. And that's my reading, that's my subjective experience. You may have nailed this the first time you read it, but I did not, and that's the point. Every time you create phonetic language without describing the accent itself, I mean, he could have simply said, even the old urban New York accents never faded with time, right? To put us in the present. You just need to say that one time, and then everybody knows exactly how this man speaks. The strange thing is, though, with all this phonetic dialogue, it drifts. It's inconsistent. So later in the book, he'll be talking, and it just sounds nothing like this. It sounds like just pretty much how anyone else would talk. And that is another way to do it if you do it purposefully. So a lot of times you might have a phonetic thing and then say, oh, this guy is from New York, so he has this urban accent. And then you'll just drop it all together, and then it's in their head for the rest of the time. But it's a mix. It's almost like he forgot that he had this accent sometimes, and then he remembered. So again, more stuff an editor would pick up. This is why you need line editors. This is why you need developmental editors. Now I will give you some more reasons of why you need to hire editors. This is not grammatically incorrect, but listen to this. A wet drip echoed. What other kind of drip is there? I believe the only other kind of drip is a wet drip, meaning there's only one kind of drip. Also, wet liquid dripped onto her from above. That is another line from this book. So again, wet liquid. What other kind of liquid is there? Liquid generally implies wetness. So again, something else an editor should have caught. It happens twice. There's a lot of rhyming. There's a lot of alliteration. Here we go. Raged surge within her, forced in from a foreign source. With a twist of her wrist, Taya ignited the blade and blindly thrust upward. So, with a twist of her wrist. Do you guys know what gerunds are? Well, if you don't, gerunds are ing words. So turning, looking, running. I think you get the idea. There are tons and tons. Honestly, these sentences hit me like a bullet while I was listening to this audiobook. So many sentences begin with grabbing her leg, comma, turning, comma, she, looking up, comma, she. All over the place. I know why I did it because I'm guilty of this. I used to do it way back when I first started writing. It's because you don't want to start every sentence with a pronoun. She this, she that, he this, he that, even their names, whatever it may be, because it becomes repetitive. And so what you do is you create a dependent clause. You have this action precede the rest of the clause so it doesn't feel repetitive. So it doesn't start with he, doesn't start with she. And because this technique was so prevalent in the book, it stood out like a sore thumb. It reminded me of my early days in writing. I'm not trying to say I'm a pro or anything like that, but it's just the mark of an amateur writer, writing that could really use a great copy editor. There was also a lot of telling in this book, like she was angry, he showed anguish on his face. It's not incorrect to say those things, but it was so prevalent in this book that it stood out to me. And I think, again, a missed opportunity, right? This is when you want to be visual. And the ironic thing is, there's a lot of this novel that's incredibly visual. I would argue too visual. So this is another thing that I learned a long time ago, is that you don't need to describe every single action, right? Let's say you have Taya. She walks into a room. She picks up a mug of coffee. You could say Taya walked into the room, snatched up a mug of coffee, and brought it to her lips. As an example, I'll tell you how he may have written it in this book. Taya walks in step by step. She extends her arm, unfurls her fingers, wraps them around the handle of the mug, slowly draws it to her lips, and drinks it down. Now that could be an effective way to write a scene if it mattered, right? If she had been desperately wishing she had that mug of coffee and thinking about it over and over and over again all the way home, and so she was savoring the moment. That is how you use proportion in writing. Even though that's an extremely visual example, even though I could picture what is happening exactly as it unfolds before my eyes, it's too much. It's too much unless there's purpose behind it. There's a lot of combat in this book that is telegraphed in extreme detail. But the funny thing is that tends to slow things down. Now I could see maybe you have this awesome move where you have like the finishing blow and you want to really go into detail, right? You want to really have them savor the moment, but it was almost as if he was having too much fun showing these characters kick and punch and shoot, that it kind of drew the combat out far longer than it needed. Every single action, not just the combat here, is generally overwritten, which again, a copy editor would help you with. And none of this stuff is wrong. None of it's incorrect. And I think that's why a lot of us miss these things. There's not necessarily any grammatical inconsistencies of what I'm talking about, but it's all about pacing. It's all about proportion. It's all about subtext. It's all about using these techniques when they are appropriate, not all the time, which is why I'm going to give A Witch's Sin by Daniel Greene a 4 out of 10. Detailed world building that results in an odd genre mashup full of characters that tick all of the archetypal boxes but never realize their full potential, and that feel like puppets in a ho-hum mystery, black and white beats on a story outline, then an emergent story, with writing that really desperately needed a great editor, developmental copy editing, to really make this thing shine. And this is, yet again, as I mentioned in my other reviews of his books, this is not a final draft. I know it sounds like I've been railing on this book a lot, and I want you to know that it comes from a place of love. I love storytelling. I love writing craft. I appreciate the craft. I respect the writing craft, and I know we're always learning out there, and I think that's the thing that bothers me the most, is clearly he put a lot of time and effort and money into this project, right? He had a massive Kickstarter, hired great cover artists, graphic designers, narrators, the whole shebang, but he's missing the key part. He's missing compelling story. But did you read A Witch's Sin? Do you disagree with me? Am I completely off base? Let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to check out my own work, my own writing, you can check out the links in the description. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.